I don't think I ever thought I'd see it, but the influence of the West is all over the streets of New York City where I live. Possibly it's due to the series of Yellowstone. Maybe it's just wanting to know a little bit more history and understanding where we came from, how this country was made. Well, today my guest is Richard Byrne, and we're going to be talking about life in the 1830s and characters like Davy Crockett. So I'm really looking forward to this, and it's just going to be fun because there's all kinds of things that we can explore here, and I don't even know where to begin except saying, welcome, Richard.
Hi, Diane. It's really great to be with you.
Now, you are the author of a new book about Davy Crockett, correct?
Yeah, it's a musical, and I wrote the book and the lyrics for it, and Dean Schlabowski of the Waco Brothers wrote the music.
Unbelievable. Now, where'd you come up with this as an angle and a topic?
So when about 12 years ago, I was up late and watching the Disney Channel.
Which is where I learned about Davy Crockett.
Exactly. So I was obsessed with Davy Crockett as a kid because I watched the Disney series with Fess Parker. It was on, and I was like, okay, it's going to be a late night because I'm going to watch this. And through the first episode, I was just wondering, why is this voice so familiar? And it was something more than just childhood. And it was only about 10 minutes into the second episode that I realized that Fess Parker sounded exactly like George W. Bush. And I just reverse engineered it, and I was like, wow, is George W. Bush's entire cadence and his way of speaking rooted in Davy Crockett? After the show, went to Google, and I found out George Bush was an 8-year-old boy in Texas when the Davy Crockett series came out. And I was like, wow, that's an amazing thing to understand about a politician, that he was so rooted and wanted to be part of Texas because his family had moved from Connecticut. They probably thought he was a Yankee. And it just got me thinking less about George W. Bush, because I really don't want to write a musical about George W. Bush, but about Davy Crockett as a politician. What was he like? What was and what was Washington, D.C., which they called Washington City back then? Mm-hmm. What was that like? So it just started. I just started doing the research on Davy Crockett as a politician, and also on Washington City in the 1830s, and that also led me to amazing women who became a real part of the musical and at the center of the musical. So that's where it started, though. It started with Disney Channel and just figuring out this weird connection between Fess Parker and George W. Bush.
Now, I will admit, and this is embarrassing to admit, but I'm going to say it right up since you mentioned the Disney. I grew up in a house you weren't allowed to watch TV, but you could read everything. My parents would get any book you wanted, and you could watch Walt Disney on, it was usually either a Saturday night at 7:30, and then it switched to Sunday nights at 7 o'clock.
Yep, exactly.
But we were allowed to watch that. And I will admit, who I used to mix up was Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone.
Yeah, and Fess Parker played both of them, actually.
Oh, well,
Yep.
Thank you for telling me that.
Yep.
Now I know in retrospect, how can I mix up two characters like that?
And that's the thing. It's a very fun, people's idea of folk heroes and legends is really it really kind of bleeds in. They bleed into each other a lot, like Johnny Appleseed too, and a lot of folk. And Kit Carson is a little bit later. He was a scout in the Southwest in the 1850s, but a lot of these larger than life figures have kind of blended together in the American imagination in a way. But yeah, Fess Parker actually also played Daniel Boone.
I feel you have relieved the stress I had going into this interview, thinking, do I really want to admit I kept mixing up Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett?
No, and the thing is, the craze of the 1950s. It's obviously I was too young to experience the initial craze, but it was bonkers in the early 50s. People were wearing coonskin caps and buying like cap gun long rifles, and Davy Crockett was everywhere.
Yeah.
It was a total mania. And it's really taken about 50 years to settle down and maybe look for a new interpretation of who Davy Crockett was.
And your timing is very interesting because, like I said, I never thought I would see groups of what looked like cowgirls walking around on the streets of New York. But that's the influence of, let's say, shows like Yellowstone.
Yep.
That have people thinking about what would it have been like in, the 1800s, trying to cut across the United States, make your stake on the land, battle with, natural forces that were here of all kinds. And it's really an intriguing period of history that apparently is resonating in a big way. So your timing, Richard, may be absolutely perfect.
Yeah, we hope so. The other thing about the American West and why it's so huge in people's imagination is because it is so huge and so many parts of it are so immensely beautiful that it's really hard. You can't turn it into an urban or even a suburban environment. Mm-hmm. It really resists that. So when you drive out into the Dakotas or into Wyoming, you are seeing landscape in many cases that pioneers saw. Yeah. And it really is, it kind of burns itself onto your brain a little bit.
That's a really good point. That landscape is the same as it was then.
Yeah. It's hard because cities, a lot of what I've tried to do with this play is find traces of Davy Crockett in cities where he did a big tour in 1834. He went to Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. And so many of the places where he spoke are gone now. But if you drive in the parts of Tennessee, you can probably see landscape as Davy Crockett saw it.
Now, would you define Davy Crockett as a politician? Who was Davy Crockett?
So Davy Crockett is a very complicated human being, way more complicated than the Disney Fess Parker version. I would say he had kind of a Quicksilver personality in that he had very strong moral convictions. He was rooted in common sense, yet he was very quick to anger, especially when he was defeated. And he was defeated a couple times in politics, and it didn't really go well for him. I think that's the way he wasn't a simple guy, and he wasn't he wasn't your fellow down at the bar just having a drink and doesn't care about anything else. He was canny, he was smart, he was at times a little bit manipulative. So he was a fascinating person to dive into and to read his letters and to read accounts of his speeches and how he would go out on the campaign trail. He was a prankster. He was constantly pulling tricks on his opponents. So he was a very complicated guy.
In the 1830s, what would have been the issues he would have been politicking on or writing about?
Well, that's the other thing that's a big part of his story is that he was an opponent of a lot of things that we would consider today to be. He was on the right side. Let's put it this way: he was on the right side of history on a lot of issues. He was really against all the chicanery and outright brutality that the United States government was leveling on Native American tribes. He was fiercely against that, voted against it in Congress. He was also very, very strongly against the increase of executive power. He really thought that power resided in the Congress. But his biggest political failure was in his part of Tennessee. A lot of folks had jumped the gun a little bit and gone out to settle the land. So they squatted, they started farming, they cleared out what's called the canebrake, which is kind of like bamboo. You can't really grow anything on it till you clear it out. So these farmers would go out, they squatted, they cleared it, they started farming it, and then Congress and the states were selling title to it to other people. So there was a huge conflict about it. And Davy Crockett was elected basically to try and get title to the land for the squatters. And he was never able to make it work. His first 4 years in Congress, he couldn't get it done for various reasons. They kicked him out for 2 years. They put him back. He still couldn't get it done. So that was he was on the, like, when we look at him writ large, he was on the right side of a lot of issues that we care about today. But on this issue of land reform, he just couldn't deliver.
Who were his primary opponents? Do you remember?
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing, too. He was from Tennessee, ran in Tennessee, and the most famous Tennessean of that moment was Andrew Jackson, President of the United States. So Crockett served under Andrew Jackson in the militia in various wars. And you would have thought that he was like a really big Andrew Jackson supporter. But as time went on, he started to get a real animus about Andrew Jackson. He saw him as, too big for his britches. He saw him, doing things that were beyond the scope of what he thought a president should do. And by 1834, they were mortal enemies. And Crockett won his seat back, basically running against Andrew Jackson. So it was a complicated situation, and that's where my musical really starts. Is that Davy Crockett gets reelected, and he's so against Andrew Jackson that this new party called the Whigs, that was basically coalesced out of 3 or 4 different parties. They're looking for a presidential candidate, and they know they need someone like Andrew Jackson. They need a frontier guy with a lot of common sense, and they start looking at Davy Crockett. So, that the musical is about sort of the rise and fall of Davy Crockett as a potential presidential candidate.
That was going to be my next question. Since you mentioned Andrew Jackson, did Davy Crockett ever try to become a presidential candidate? Okay.
Yeah, they wanted him to be, so the Whigs took him. The Whigs booked this huge tour for him, where he went to all these cities, and thousands of people turned up because the 2 years. So he lost his congressional election in 1831. And then he only got elected again in 1833. But in the years between 1831 and 1833, he became an international legend. A guy wrote a play about him called The Lion of the West, and he tried to disguise Crockett's name as Nimrod Wildfire. And the play was a humongous hit, and it turned him into certainly an American celebrity and an international celebrity. So he went back to Washington as one of the most popular and well-known Americans in the country. And the Whigs were like, yeah, let's get him on the road. And they put him on a speaking tour, and he was drawing thousands and thousands of people in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. And things were set. I mean, he was being taken very seriously as a presidential candidate, but he lost his seat in 1835. And that popped the entire balloon, because you can't lose your congressional seat twice and be considered to be for president.
Now, in the 1830s, how many political parties were there?
Well, there were, at the beginning of the 1830s, there were about 5 or 6. The Democrats were the most important, but then there were a whole bunch of other groupings, like there were anti-Mason parties. There was this Democrat-Republican party that Henry Clay, the really famous senator, was the head of. And all of these parties finally understood that they needed to come together if they were going to have any chance of winning. And so they all eventually came together under the heading of the Whig Party, which lasted from the 1830s until like the late 1850s.
Well, what created the demise of that Whig Party, since it's always interesting that we're a 2-party system instead of a 3-party, like some other
so the Whigs, the Whigs kind of fractured under the weight of their own divisions, and slavery became a humongous issue for a broad part of the American population. and the Republican Party, which, as you know, Abraham Lincoln was the first president elected as a Republican. That Republican Party quickly became the dominant political force, and they replaced the Whigs, basically. And that's where we have the two-party system. It dates basically back to the late 1850s.
Now
Our present one.
How your play unfolds.
Yeah, so Davy Crockett gets his seat back, and he comes to Washington City, and what he discovers is that the capital is growing, and there's a lot of competition for his attention, and even where he's going to stay. So we know from history that for his first 2 terms, he stayed at a place called Mrs. Ball's boarding house, which is right at 7th and Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest in D.C. And right now the Department of Commerce building is on that site. But across the street was the most famous hotel in Washington at that time, which was called Brown's Indian Queen Hotel. And it was fancy. It was like $22 a week. It was a serious place. And Crockett, sometime in 1835, probably with money from the Whigs, moved across the street from Mrs. Ball's to the Brown's Indian Queen. And a big mechanism of the play is this battle between Mrs. Ball and Mrs. Brown over who's going to get Davy Crockett to stay in their place.
Oh, that's a funny premise.
Yeah, it was fun. Well, and see, the thing is, once you discover these stories about women in the 1830s, it opens up like all these amazing vistas for you as a writer to kind of pull great voices into it. I would say the biggest person I found was this woman named Anne Royall, who was, again, one of the most famous American celebrities of the early 19th century. She was a woman who wrote a whole bunch of travel books. Then she came to D.C. to try and get her husband's pension. She married a much older man who was a Revolutionary War veteran, and he was owed a pension, but he didn't get it. So she went to D.C. to go get his pension. She ended up staying, writing books about the Congress, and then she started her own newspaper, which eventually she called The Huntress. And she's an amazing figure. People had so many different opinions about her. She was very anti-clerical. She didn't like the Presbyterians in her neighborhood, and they basically sued her and had her charged as a common scold, which was a weird, antiquated thing. But the punishment for it, one of the punishments for it was to be literally ducked in water, almost like a witch. So they had a trial of Anne Royall. She was convicted of being a common scold, but the judge said she only had to pay a fine. And within half a day, people from Andrew Jackson's cabinet came up with the money and paid her fine.
Oh my gosh, what a story.
But she was amazing. She ran every week. She printed a newspaper every week for about 23 years, and she sold it every Saturday at the Library of Congress.
Oh my goodness, what an interesting story.
Yeah, so she's basically the co-lead of the musical with Davy Crockett, and she's kind of the audience's guide as to like what's going on and who are these politicians and who are these boarding house people. And yeah, so it's been, finding her was really a gift, and she's a big part of the play.
How would you describe life in the 1830s? You know, you got some big hotels in Washington, but what was the overall scene, the vibe?
Yeah, there's a song in the play called Washington City, and it's about, it's Mrs. Ball and Mrs. Brown offering their competing versions of the city. And Mrs. Ball is talking about what the city's like now, and Mrs. Brown has a vision of the city of what it might become, which is what we see today, like all these beautiful, historical buildings and monuments and statues and stuff like that. But Mrs. Ball's account of Washington City is it's not a very nice place to live. There's no sewer system. There's no trash collection. People literally throw their trash into the streets, where pigs run through the streets and eat it. There's very little light. There's like gas lights and stuff, so there's no electric. It gets dark really fast, and it's not a very pleasant place to live. In fact, the White House, you would think the White House would be somehow special or privileged, but there was an open sewer literally near the White House grounds, and you could smell it in the White House all the time. So it wasn't a fun place to live, and it's what I think this is something that is not just Washington D.C., but with every city along the American seaboard at that time. You know, the grand houses you see that were built in that era by the bankers and politicians, they really were castles because they were built of stone or brick. They were well lit, right? Open, you get open light. The windows in these places are huge. You get open light all the time, and there's an army of people that are hired to keep them clean and to cook the food. So they're castles. And when you think about the class differences of that era, like why the rich were seen as like almost gods, is because they lived in these amazing places. They didn't really have to deal with the pigs in the street, or the mud that's getting your cart bogged down in the street, because there's no paving. There's only cobblestones or sometimes brick.
You hear that and you wonder, or I wonder, how do cities ever get built? Why didn't everybody just say, I can go out to the country area, take my little piece of land, even if it's a quarter of an acre, and not have to deal with my next door neighbor's poop?
Yep. And that's part of, living in don't get me wrong, living on the frontier or in the country in the 1830s wasn't easy either. But you were far away from those smells and those inconveniences. And it's why perfume was so important, because people just they wanted to smell something other than the street. It's really, it is kind of astonishing. And when you're writing about that era, it's really hard to kind of work that in. You see these historical dramas, and nobody ever has to deal with these inconveniences. We just move from scene to scene and everything's fine. But it was nasty. It was not a fun place to be. And Washington City in particular had problems because it was a city that was started from scratch. Like, they put it in the middle of nowhere on a swamp that was between the North and the South, which is what everybody wanted. But it didn't grow organically. It didn't grow like New York City. It didn't grow like Philadelphia or Boston, where people settled it and then the cities grew out of people's needs. The Washington City was like created just to be a city,
What was your most, besides Davy Crockett or the newspaper publisher you just mentioned, who were two of your one or two unexpected characters you found as you were researching this, and you said, oh wow, never knew about this one?
So the one character that was really amazing was this guy Adam Huntsman, who was a lawyer who had lost a leg in one of the wars in the 1820s. And he ran against it. He wrote a nasty book about Davy Crockett, and they were kind of enemies. And then when a guy who had beaten Davy Crockett once lost to Davy Crockett, Huntsman said, "Okay, I'll run against him." And it was a nasty campaign, and but Huntsman won, and Davy Crockett did not take it well, and he actually called Huntsman a timber toe to make fun of his leg. It was like, he really was. Davy Crockett was I think Davy Crockett was a really wonderfully rich, complex character, but he was a very sore loser. So he called Huntsman a timber toe, and on the campaign trail he called him a possum head, and people were like, "What's a possum head?" And Crockett said, "I have cut open the heads of many possums, and I have never found a brain in it." So, so to call someone a possum head was like, "You don't have any brains, sir." I also found a character, the painter who painted a really famous portrait of Davy Crockett, was an interesting guy. His name was Chapman, and he had Davy Crockett pose in his studio, and it turned out to be a big mess. And Crockett wasn't super cooperative. And they also, like, if you look at any painting of Davy Crockett, his portraits are of almost like a well-mannered middle-class guy. This was the only painting of him where they put him in his hunting gear, and he didn't have a coonskin cap. He had a hunting hat, but the Whigs really wanted a portrait of him as in his natural, frontiersman state, and not as like a comfortable congressman.
Huh. Oh my gosh, this is so fascinating. Now your play, is it produced right now? Is it something you're in? What phase is it at?
Yeah, so we had a big staged reading of it in 2024 in Washington D.C. at the True Reformer building, which is right at U Street, and it's just been restored, and its claim to fame is it's where Duke Ellington played his very first concert and went home with 10 cents. So we had a great reading there, and then my collaborator Dean Schlabowski, who wrote all the amazing music for this, it went so well that we just decided we really wanted to bring this work to the public. So we've been recording like a soundtrack of all the songs from the musical that's out right now. And then on June 29th, we're releasing an online, basically like a radio play version where we blend the songs into the text. So everyone's going to be able to hear it for free on June 29th. And you can get the CD right now. And it's on every streaming platform, and it's available as a compact disc and digital.
Oh my gosh, you're in New York City. You sound like something that, the Union League has those great ballrooms. You sound like a great show for,
Yeah, it's a really fun. I think it's a really fun musical because it's mostly country music, which is not a super it's not an overdone genre of music for a musical, but it's just got a lot of fun and life and characters, and there's a lot of movement in it. There's a lot of stage stuff that goes on. And so we think it's like we tried to figure out. One of the things that inspired us was what was a campaign event like in Tennessee in the 1830s, and it was like two guys getting up on tree stumps. There were people playing fiddles. There was whiskey all over the place, and that's the kind of musical we really wanted to write.
Oh my gosh, Richard, these always go too fast, but there are going to be everybody. I've been speaking with Richard Byrne. He's the what do you say? Author, the playwright?
Yeah, the co-author. I wrote the book and the lyrics for Congressman Davy, which is right here.
Here we go. There will be links to the CD to Richard to learn more about what he's doing. I'm Dian Griesel. This has been the Silver Disobedience Perception Dynamics podcast. My guest has been Richard Byrne. This was just a fun episode. I learned a lot, and I also, big highlight was I was not too humiliated by exposing that I was mixing up Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett for basically my whole life since I was a little kid, and Richard resolved me of that conflict. So there alone, it's worth listening to this entire episode. Thank you,
there you
Richard.
Go. Thank you.
Richard. Any last words?
No, it's been really terrific to be with you, and this is such a rich part of history with so many parallels to where we are right now. Just such partisan rancor, bad electoral losers, and people forgetting that we're Americans and we got to be not at war with each other, but a little bit more collaborative about it.
Cannot get a better soundbite than that one, Richard. Thank you. Again, I'm Dian Griesel. This is the Silver Disobedience Perception Dynamics podcast, and I've been speaking with Richard Byrne. Please subscribe and hit all the links below so you can follow what Richard's been doing, because this is timely. Even though we were talking about the 1830s, let me tell you, one thing I learned in this episode, or I'm constantly reminded of, history repeats itself. So please follow him and stay in touch. See you soon.